It's now over to me to give a very warm welcome to all of you who've come to this first inaugural lecture of the Monsignor Denis Edwards Fellow this year, on the topic of the future is at hand, theological and philosophical perspectives on the global pandemic. But before I hand over to him, Emmanuel Nathan, and rather to Tim Howells as well, who's going to chair this session, I just wanted to say a few words about how this fellowship originated. Denis Edwards was probably the closest to a mentor that I have had throughout my career, and I knew him for over 20 years. He was a gentle giant, an amazing person, as well as a very rigorous academic who worked at both the pastoral and the practical and the academic levels simultaneously. He was someone I met through the theology and science conversation, but then I came to know him too through his interest in eco-theology. And I started to think of Australia as being the hub of all eco-theology on the global scene. And as a result, in 2003, I made a long trip to Australia to 2 different conference events going on that year with my husband and my 3-year-old daughter in tow. And one of the most generous acts that he made was to open up his presbytery to us so that we had somewhere to stay. This was the kind of person he was. He was very affirming of women, very affirming of anyone who was considered perhaps the more marginalized in the Catholic community. He wanted to actually speak in a way that made sense to ordinary parishioners, but also do work that was intellectually respectable and supported by the tradition. So he was a systematic thinker, but also a pastoral one. And so it was when he very sadly passed away suddenly in 2019, I knew that we had to do something at the newly born Laudato Si Research Institute. And I think if he had been around at that time when the plans for the Laudato Si Research Institute were beginning to be made public, I think he would have enjoyed coming here. And perhaps even now he is witnessing this from wherever he is in the next life. But before we start, and I hand over, I just want to give the final quote in his book on deep incarnation that was published posthumously, is a quote from Laudato Si. And it's that faith that he has expressed in that quote that comes from Laudato Si that I think is a fitting testament and testimony to the kind of person he was. And so this is what he says, the very last words in his book. At the end, we will find ourselves face to face with the infinite beauty of God and be able to read with admiration and happiness the mystery of the universe, which with us we will share an unending plenitude. Eternal life will be a shared experience of awe in which each creature, resplendently transfigured, will take its rightful place and have something to give those poor men and women who will have been liberated once and for all. And that's a quotation from paragraph 243 of Laudato Si. So it's with great honour and great respect that we offer this lecture, and indeed this whole fellowship series, which we hope will continue for some time to come, to Denis Edwards in his memory. And with that, I both welcome you and now hand over to Tim Howells, who's going to be chairing the session for us. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Celia, and a very warm welcome as well from me to you all. It's lovely to have you with us on this occasion. My name is Dr. Tim Howells, and I'm Assistant Director for Research Programming at the Laudato Si Research Institute, based here at Campion Hall, University of Oxford. Our mission at the Institute is to contribute to the global effort to address the socio-ecological crisis of our time. And we do that by transdisciplinary research, by teaching, by scholarly partnerships across the world, and by hosting public events like the one you're attending this evening. We meet tonight online, of course, due to current circumstances, but it's a great pleasure to be with you and to welcome our lecturer tonight. Before I introduce him, a couple of brief housekeeping notices, if I may. First of all, we're using a Zoom functionality here that means audience members are not visible or audible to each other. So you can't see each other, and feel free, therefore, to have your camera and audio on or off as you wish. After the lecture tonight, we'd love to receive your questions and comments. The way to do that is to type in via the Q&A button that you should see at the bottom of your screen, or if you hover your mouse down there. Do write at any point during the lecture that follows, and I'll do my best to moderate and feed in those questions to Emmanuel so he has a chance to reply. There'll be plenty of time allocated to that. You can also write anonymously if you'd rather your name does not appear against the question. Finally, to remind you that the lecture tonight is being recorded and will be available on the LSRI YouTube channel tomorrow. We'll also send a follow-up email to thank you for your participation, and the link will be there too. But now, if I might prompt Emmanuel to come on the screen when he's ready, and I will introduce him to you all. Well, Dr. Emmanuel Nathan is Director of the Research Centre for Studies of the Second Vatican Council at the Faculty of Theology and Philosophy, Australian Catholic University. Based in Sydney, he is concurrently a senior lecturer in biblical studies and comparative theology. Active in interfaith and ecumenical dialogue, Dr. Nathan is involved with the Australian Council of Christians and Jews, and in 2018 was appointed by the Pontifical Commission for Promoting Christian Unity to sit on the Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission. And of course, as Celia mentioned, we're proud to have Emmanuel as our current Denis Edwards Visiting Fellow here at the LSRI in Oxford. As well as this lecture and other contributions, Emmanuel is using this fellowship time to work on a monograph which argues for a more interconnected, ecosystemic way of engaging with biblical texts. So that, I think, is enough from me. Allow me now to hand over to Emmanuel for the lecture entitled "The Future is at Hand, Theological and Philosophical Perspectives on the Global Pandemic." Emmanuel, thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you to Celia for that very lovely introduction. I'm just going to share my screen and hope that I'm choosing the right one. There we go. Excellent. I hope it's coming through. I would like to begin by acknowledging, as is customary, the traditional owners of the lands on which my office stands, the Wongal clan of the Eora Nation here in Sydney. I would like to pay respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and thank them for their wisdom and guidance. I too would like to recall with fondness the memory of Monsignor Professor Denis Edwards, after whom this fellowship is named. He was a wonderful mentor and senior colleague, as Celia so rightly pointed out, and we continue to miss him. Let me also thank the partnership between the Laudato Si Research Institute at Campion Hall in Oxford and the Faculty of Theology and Philosophy at Australian Catholic University for making this fellowship possible. I thank Professor Celia Dean Drummond, and I'm especially grateful for the close contact I've enjoyed with Dr. Tim Howells and Ms. Harriet David. Sadly, it is because of the global pandemic that I'm giving this lecture online from Sydney. And lastly, conscious that the Denis Edwards Visiting Fellowship is open to scholars living in Australia, New Zealand, and Oceania, I would like to remember especially the Tongan community here in Australia who are waiting anxiously for news of their loved ones families or friends back home in Tonga in the wake of the recent volcanic eruption and tsunami. We continue to hope for their safety and well-being. And now I can begin. And I should perhaps do so by stating the obvious, that theology and philosophy are rather unusual disciplines to look towards for perspectives on our current global coronavirus pandemic. And let me immediately assure everyone that my limitations as an academic theologian specializing in religious texts do not embolden me to speak outside the field of my expertise. I also am not harboring a long abandoned view that theology should be regarded as the queen of the sciences. In fact, I propose a far more modest approach that theological and philosophical perspectives may serve as a hopefully helpful detour as we contemplate what the future of our world in a post-COVID context should look like. This lecture will in fact reflect on how we as human beings structure time. In particular, I'm interested in the way we use narratives, stories as vehicles to situate our lives within time and give them meaning. Before we explore this further, I would like to offer some concrete and current scenarios by way of illustration. I have been struck by the very different responses in tackling the coronavirus pandemic globally, as opposed to, let's say, climate change. Whereas the world quickly galvanized itself into concerted actions to fight the virus, for instance, in the rapid development of vaccines, by comparison, the recent UN Climate Change Conference, COP26, held in Glasgow last year, fell very short of its ambitious plans to get the world's nations to commit to reaching net zero carbon emissions by mid-century. Now, while the underlying reasons to either crisis are varied and complex, I continue to be struck by these very different responses to crises at a global level. The coronavirus crisis has seemingly galvanized responses of a proactive nature and the ability to accentuate global interconnectedness and concerted action. By contrast, the desire to combat climate change is very often marred by a sense of inertia or inaction on the part of participating nations or corporations, fueling in turn feelings of despair among increasingly more vocal citizens of the world that we are doing too little too late. Whereas the climate change crisis engenders discussions of passing a tipping point of no return, not helped by the ferocity and frequency of extreme weather patterns and natural disasters. Most efforts surrounding the handling of the coronavirus pandemic have been spurred by a desire to return to normal. Put simply, the coronavirus years have been marked by this worldly drive to either restore things to the way they were before the onset of the pandemic, or increasingly forming new habits that will allow us to live endemically alongside the virus. In other words, the coronavirus has not dampened our resolve to imagine and provide for a future beyond the current crisis. Our concerns about climate change, however, for those who do take the threat to our planet seriously enough, are that worryingly, we may no longer have a future for this planet unless drastic and monumental action is taken. There is no planet B, we are warned. When it comes to the coronavirus, we have collectively told ourselves as a world community that we can and must beat the virus. But when it comes to climate change, the world seems to lack a unified resolve. Instead, we are constantly confronted by the fact that we are not doing enough. Whereas in both cases, it has become common to use apocalyptic imagery. In the popular sense of disaster or destruction, there is a striking shift in perception between the two crises. In terms of the global pandemic, we are willing ourselves, at least in some countries, like the UK, for instance, to see the move from pandemic to endemic COVID as an end game. We are told that the seemingly endless mutations of the virus feel like a film without an ending. We humor ourselves that when we reach the last letter of the Greek alphabet, omega, that we will have come hopefully to the end of COVID too. Whereas with climate change, our imagination of the future is far less hopeful. I should reiterate that I do not view the global coronavirus pandemic and climate change as equivalent crises. My noticing and articulation of the difference in human responses to them is really for the heuristic purpose of reflecting more deeply on whether, and if so, how, our imagination of the future has been inflected by the recent global pandemic. I also do not wish to suggest that the desire for a return to some form of quotidian normality or the urgency of an impending apocalypse are fixed and universal responses to either crisis. That would not only be overly simplistic and generalizing, but I would equally venture that certainly in terms of the coronavirus, we are still making sense of the past 2 years of living under a global pandemic. In fact, for most countries, other than the lucky and wealthy few, the world is still in the throes of the pandemic and not yet ready to enter the next phase of endemicity. In what follows, I propose to probe the story of our human conceptualizations of the future from the perspectives of theology and philosophy. As mentioned already, I do so fully aware that these are not self-evident places to start such a reflection. At the same time, I hope it will become evident that theology and philosophy have a long tradition of reflecting on such matters. It will therefore be necessary for me to set out a clear trajectory for the remainder of this lecture. I propose to offer an analysis in 3 movements, if you will. I've named them respectively the temporal turn, the linguistic turn, and the future interrupted. In the last of these movements, I will briefly entertain an analysis of 2 religious texts. While this returns me to my original specialization in the study of ancient texts, my purpose is really to treat them as case studies in how groups, and here religious groups, as narrative communities, inscribe their memories and experiences with an orientation towards the future. My hope is that this can be a stimulus to how we will choose to tell the story forwards of our global pandemic. So my first movement, the temporal turn from imagined apocalypse to apocalyptic imagination. For convenience and time, but also for clarity of trajectories, I have identified 3 authors as representative guides to each of my 3 movements this evening. My first guide is the Belgian theologian and philosopher of religion, Lieven Boeve. In his 2007 God Interrupts History, Boeve has helpfully analyzed apocalyptic thinking in both secular and religious, specifically Christian, terms. Boeve discerned a paradox within Western culture. While mature Christian theological reflection had domesticated apocalyptic thinking for the most part of the 20th century, consider, for instance, Bultmann's demythologization, somehow a secular version of apocalypticism was taking hold in certain segments of society in the run-up to and turn of the millennium. These groups were usually seeking to reclaim a sense of certainty and stability in the face of what they considered the unbearable uncertainties and insecurities of the postmodern age, which had vacated the security afforded by the grand master narratives of modernity. As Boeve says, We have already referred to the evident paradox that a secularized yet often quasi-religious form of apocalyptic awareness has emerged in our culture in spite of the fact that apocalypticism has been abandoned by contemporary Christian faith and theology as irrelevant and outdated. Rather than plead for an uneasy alliance between Christian theological reflection and latter-day secular apocalypticism, Bouvet instead argued for a retrieval of Christianity's own rootedness in apocalyptic traditions, which, owing to its early Jewish origins, it had borrowed and recontextualized from Second Temple Judaism. Following this line of thinking, Bouvet acknowledged his indebtedness to the political theology of Johann Baptist Metz. Metz himself was explicit in drawing inspiration from Jewish theological thought that was both temporal at its core and shaped by suffering. The apocalypticism that infused Metz's thought was therefore not an escape from history into the mythical or the metaphorical. Metz's idea of a dangerous memory is in fact rooted in the very particularity of history, because it calls attention to the cries for justice that emanate from those who are suffering. To quote Bouvet again, the task of the Church as the narrative community of the dangerous memory is to remind postmodern society that human history is also a history of suffering, injustice, and the absence of reconciliation. As such, it is likewise a history of anxiety and the cry for justice. It is this very awareness that dominates the apocalyptic understanding of God's imminent judgment in which history is interrupted. As a fundamental theologian, Bouvet's work intersects both theology and philosophy, and his Flemish context makes him conversant in continental European and Anglo-American traditions, particularly in the interaction between religion and secular culture. Bouvet is therefore a useful indicator of currents of thought prevalent in the first decade of the new millennium, when related fields in theology, philosophy, religious, biblical, and even Jewish studies were undergoing what has been termed the temporal turn, scholarly interest in time and temporality. Using the categories of recontextualization and interruption, Bouvet's constructive treatment of time and apocalypticism helpfully offers the possibility for the usual historical studies of ancient apocalyptic literature to be given a contemporary relevance and resonance. Rather than a study of imagined apocalypse, Bouvet allows us to contemplate the power of the apocalyptic imagination when time and history itself is interrupted. I turn now to my second movement, the linguistic turn from narrative time to narrative identity. A revival of scholarly interest in temporality and apocalypticism is perhaps unsurprising, owing to the turn of the millennium in the year 2000. Culturally, too, the early years of the new millennium witnessed geopolitical events that were unhelpfully framed as a clash of civilizations. Apocalyptic imagery very often accompanied the framing of such events, and scholars, as we have seen with Bouvet, were keen to resist such populist misappropriation. But it is not that an awareness of temporality was missing from the linguistic turn, the study of language as a structuring principle in human understanding, which preoccupied theology, philosophy, and related fields in the latter half of the 20th century. And here I take the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur as a guide. Ricoeur's long and distinguished academic career allowed him to span several currents of thought, and he helped to bridge an intellectual divide when his intercontinental move from France to the United States introduced his thought to an American audience. Now, it is not my ambition in this short lecture to synthesize Ricoeur's thought or his works. It is well known that his writings on hermeneutics are indispensable to theology and philosophy. These writings have influenced nearly all contemporary discussions in philosophical, theological, and biblical hermeneutics, even when we are not always agreed on how or even whether these hermeneutical insights complement the advancements in historical critical studies of ancient texts. Ricoeur's work in hermeneutics builds upon the philosophical hermeneutics of Hans-Georg Gadamer and Martin Heidegger before him. Both Ricoeur's hermeneutical arc, moving from first to second naivete through a movement of critical explanation, or his development of the narrative arc following a trajectory of three mimetic moments of prefiguration, configuration, and refiguration, can be viewed as refinements upon Gadamer's more basic fusion of horizons, the intersubjective relationship between the projected horizon of a text's meaning fusing with the projected horizon of a reader attempting to understand that text's meaning, and constantly generating new understandings whenever engaging with that text. Ricoeur developed these refinements in his encounters with structuralism, semiotics, and analytic philosophy across the years. The 3 volumes of Time and Narrative carefully analyzed emplotment, episodic structure, and the way temporality functioned in narratives. But it was later in Oneself as Another that Ricoeur moved his and our attention to human beings as storied selves, as individuals who seek to understand themselves narratively. To quote Dan Stiver on Ricoeur, our situated passage through time means that the self is not embodied and in the world, rather it is also a story. Ricoeur understands humans as inherently story-shaped, and he also notes the centrality of narrative to scripture. Our finite location in time and space provides for the drama of extended and meaningful action. In other words, a plot. We implot ourselves as we go. By the time one reached the end of Oneself as Another, Ricoeur was already turning his attention to ethical identity as a direct follow-through to narrative identity. A decade later, Ricoeur too made the temporal turn in his last work, Memory, History, Forgetting, 1 year before his passing. But coming as it did towards the end of his professional career, he felt the ethical burden of history most of all. In giving precedence to memory in the first part of the book, Ricoeur was already signaling that he considered memory as more fundamental to understanding the human condition. To quote the review from the review essay by the American historian Hayden White, which is why it seems to me that in spite of his respect for the kind of scholarship produced by professional historians in their study of the past, Ricoeur wished to expand the concept of historicity to include not only a philosophically responsible idea of its relation to temporality on the one side, but also, and even more importantly, its relation to ethics, morality, and political life on the other. In bookending his volume with the theme of forgetting, Ricoeur focused the book's conclusions on the ethical responsibilities of memory and history. In dwelling on the interplay of amnesty and amnesia, he wished to open a door philosophically for individuals and communities, not simply to be trapped in the past, whether held captive by memory or by history. Unsurprisingly, then, in his epilogue, he wrestled with the difficult theme of forgiveness. For the past to have a future, for humans to succeed in creating future memories that can outlast them, Ricoeur makes one final turn, the turn to the ethical. and in doing so, Ricoeur perhaps came closest, despite the many detours of his life's philosophical investigations, to the ethical philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas. The previous two movements coalesce in their attention to ethical concerns. Bouve's retrieval of the apocalyptic imagination, both from Christianity's early Jewish origins and the political theology of Johann Baptist Metz, also drawing from contemporary Jewish theology, is a reminder that the task of the Christian theological imagination should be an ethical one, to interrupt and resist human history when it perpetrates and perpetuates histories of suffering and injustice. Similarly, Ricoeur's philosophical detours through narrative and temporality end with the claim that ethics places upon our narrative identities, memories, and histories. In my third and final movement, I now wish to return to my original specialization in the study of ancient texts, and I will briefly consider two religious texts, but rest assured not subject them to an exhaustive exegesis. I wish instead to use them as showcases in how groups shape and reshape their narrative identities with an eye to the future. The first of these texts, the fourth book of Ezra, for Ezra will rely on the work of the Oxford-based scholar of biblical studies and Second Temple Judaism, Professor Hindi Naiman. In her book, Losing the Temple and Recovering the Future, Naiman analyzed both the historical contexts and literary strategies behind the non-canonical text of 4 Ezra, a text originally written in the aftermath of the destruction of the Second Temple, roughly around the year 100 of the Common Era. It is particularly Naiman's analysis of the way in which 4 Ezra conceptualizes the future that I find resonates with our current context. Naiman argued that 4 Ezra displayed a complex temporal structure in which later traditions reimagined the exilic past in order to make the future possible. The cultural devastation or trauma of the destruction of the Second Temple had, in the year 70, frozen time for Jewish communities. In order to reimagine a future for these communities to survive religiously after the destruction of what had been the centerpiece of Jewish religious life, the author of 4 Ezra actually chose to do so by setting his text centuries back at the destruction of the First Temple in the year 586 before the Common Era. What the author effectively did was, in Naiman's terms, reboot the covenantal relationship between God and Israel. To quote Naiman, in order to unfreeze the present and recover the future, 4 Ezra reboots the past. In so doing, it relies on an important fact about literary traditions expressed in an insightful remark by Borges. The fact is that every writer creates his own precursors. His work modifies our conception of the past as it will modify the future. This seems paradoxical, but it is a fundamental truth that literary traditions possess a retroactive sort of causality with respect to the past that enables them to have a prospective power over the future. End quote. In narratively creating this imagined past, the author of 4 Ezra wished to show that while destruction of the temple, the locus for divine encounter, could not be overcome, nonetheless divine revelation persisted. For the author of 4 Ezra, that divine revelation is manifested through literary production, the writing of texts, among them the text of 4 Ezra. That is how 4 Ezra conceptualizes and inscribes what Naiman terms revelation inflected by destruction. Naiman's analysis is fascinating, not just in terms of the new perspectives she sheds on the text of 4 Ezra, but for our purposes, how calamity and crisis can influence the reimagination and reinscription of the future for a community. I cannot help but think here of the standstill we time and again had to come to during our many lockdowns. One could say that we are still in the process of finding the proper reboot narrative with which to unfreeze the past 2 years and imagine ourselves forward. What comes next is a question we do not simply ask as individuals. It preoccupies nations and governments too. The example of 4 Ezra also confirms that we look to previous categories, literary traditions, types, and typologies in order to clad the future that we aspire to. In that sense, the future we project is not a tabula rasa. It is an act of imagination, using memories of things past, but now projected into the future. They are memories reconfigured to supply us with narrative identities in the future that lies beyond the calamity we have just experienced. And because we are imagining a future after crisis, we search for memories that are familiar to us and make us feel safe, but also have the potential to propel us forward into the future. This is not unlike what we are experiencing now. At once a desire to return to normal, but having been tinged by calamity and crisis, we resign ourselves to life in the new normal, lives now punctuated with the need for masks, QR codes, and vaccine certificates, social distancing, and so on. I would add to Naiman's study of 4 Ezra one other text as a case study, this time from the New Testament. In another context, I've studied the gospel passage of the walk to Emmaus in chapter 24 of the Gospel of Luke as an invitation to the disciples to recognize their risen Lord in the face of a stranger. Following Naiman, though, I might add that this Lucan resurrection appearance can also be read as a case study in reimagining the future of the Jesus movement after calamity. The disciples are overcome by despair as they leave Jerusalem for Emmaus in the aftermath of the crucifixion. The exegesis of Scripture by the stranger, culminating in the breaking of the bread at the meal, stimulates not just the memories of the disciples, but also the readers or hearers of the gospel. The experience of these 2 disciples can now be collated and collected into the sequence of resurrection appearances by the risen Jesus. But we miss perhaps an important detail if we consider this only as part of a collection of resurrection appearances. In this episode, for example, recognition and understanding only come when the risen Lord vanishes from their sight. The revelation that is inflected by the trauma and calamity of the crucifixion means that the risen Jesus must from now on be recognized in kindness extended to the stranger. And this would be consistent with the general theology of the Lucan Gospel. Consider, for instance, the parable of the Good Samaritan in chapter 10. It is also consistent with the quotidian details that the author of Luke relishes in writing the story of the Evangelion, the good news, as a history and not a kerygma. The same author ends the book of Acts with Paul under house arrest in Rome. And whereas there is still debate on the genre of 4 Ezra as an apocalypse, the author of Luke and Acts uses instead historical genre to reimagine the future of the early Jesus movement after calamity. By way of conclusion, I return to the opening observations with which I began. Is our perception of the future changing as a result of our living into the reality of a global pandemic, the scale none of us could have anticipated as 2019 ended? If we look at the way the world galvanized itself into action to fight the virus, to develop vaccines, one might have the impression that we somehow managed to set aside our popular obsession with apocalyptic doomsday scenarios. As we gradually emerge out of lockdowns and transition from pandemic to endemic thinking, we will turn our attention to telling the story of the pandemic. We will seek to unfreeze time with stories that implot our narrative identities temporally, of times spent in lockdowns, in casualty wards, at vaccination centers. We will seek to situate these little narratives into the larger narratives of who we are, the narrative identities of the communities we form a part. To do so, we will rely on previous narratives, archetypes or topologies with which to tell the stories of this time. Perhaps they will be parsed apocalyptically. I would like to suggest that they were neither solely apocalyptic nor completely quotidian. Instead, they will tell stories of human courage, but also suffering, of altruism, but also divisiveness and glaring inequalities. In short, they will represent the full range of our human complexities. In doing so, we will seek to find meaning in them. We will situate these stories temporally. Among our strategies, we will tell linear stories of development and progress. We will also recognize the cyclical nature of common tropes in our human histories. We might also discern how we went through stages of reimagining our future, whether as a return to the way things were, or as hopeful aspiration for a better, kinder, more interconnected world. But we also imagined a future filled with quotidian and sobering new realities. We will discover that our narratives did not always resolve as neatly as we like our histories, novels, or scripts to be. But opting for complex and thick narratives will expand our future imagination beyond simply binary choices between optimism and despair. In doing so, we would rediscover that creating narratives of radical hope were how our precursors reimagined the future of their communities after crises. And these narratives have somehow stood the test of time. And we might wish to do the same. Thank you.
Emmanuel, thank you very much indeed for that very stimulating lecture, for the many insights that you've given to us. For my own part, as someone who perhaps does feel a little bit stuck in the present right now, you've shown us a form of the past that can be more than just what has happened and is finished, but can inform the present, and a future as well that can be more than simply what is to come, but it can serve as something like a horizon of hope for us. So thank you very much indeed. We do have now just under 15 minutes for questions. There are one or two coming in, so please do click down there on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type in your question and we'll come to those just in a moment. Shall I start us off with one now, Emmanuel?
Please do.
I think we will have a number, so feel free to be as succinct as you wish in answering. But picking up the theme of apocalyptic, I do agree that that language has been increasingly appealed to by all sorts of people in the present moment, non-theologians, and especially scientists, actually, as a way of warning the public of the imminence and the severity of the coming crisis as they see it. So here, apocalyptic language is used as an energizer to the public realm. But it seems to me that biblical apocalyptic is often framed as an appeal to patience, to waiting, endurance perhaps of the faithful, even to a submission to God, who will act finally in the end to make things right, and not necessarily in the present. Perhaps it's a call to stand and wait, as Milton, to quote Milton. And I guess to get technical, we can see aspects of that conceptualization in various 20th century thinkers, from Carl Schmitt right up to some contemporary theorists. So do you want to just say something? Is there a tension there? If apocalyptic is being used to sort of energize us, but actually in its original formulation, it was given to make us wait and be patient and not to get too political in the present.
I would agree with you, Tim, in the sense that the secular version of apocalypticism, as it were, has taken the idea in a very different direction, and you've pointed it out very succinctly and very correctly. While there was also waiting for the early communities, there was the desire too that, or at least the conviction and the hope that it was around the corner. There was an imminence there that somehow we've had to reckon with, has been expanded. So the waiting was not an indefinite waiting in perhaps the sense that we have, let's say, the waiting for this to end, this pandemic to end. But there is a tension there. And I think Lieven Boeve was able to put his finger on the way that there was a detemporalization of apocalyptic imagination. And he was trying to reclaim that interruptive nature, that it is really a transcendent other who will interrupt, as opposed to just the rush and urgency of a doomsday scenario that we tend to latch onto.
Wonderful, thank you. Let's turn now, the questions are flying in. So here's one from Professor Michael Flower, who says this: it would seem that the growing impacts of the Anthropocene produce challenges that are new and intricately entangled, perhaps without sufficient lessons from the past. So do we have good reason to think our powers and vehicles of empowerment are in fact up to the novel tasks at hand? Are we likely to be good enough storytellers? What are the weaknesses we must overcome?
That's a great question. It's one of the big challenges of our time, and maybe this says a little bit about my own sort of mourning for our literary imagination, that in the age of social media and less text and iconic ways of thinking, that we ignore and forget the beautiful ways in which the past has been represented in words. These are some of the challenges and the weaknesses that we might experience. At the same time, the younger generation is finding their way better than we ever could, and are becoming quite vocal. I think of the young activists who are really inviting us to imagine new scenarios. So I think they're inviting them into the conversation and trying to transcend the noise of our echo chambers might be a good way forward.
Lovely, thank you. Another question here from coming in from the Philippines. Thank you, Dr. Nathan, for your wonderful lecture. To follow your line of thought, narrative identities born out of disaster, as in the case of Second Temple destruction, can become sources of ethical identities in order to move towards some imagined future within a disastrous global pandemic. While the temporal turn, he continues, out of which those narrative and ethical identities are forged, has indeed preoccupied Christianity for centuries, there is also a movement in some disciplines towards a spatial turn, a challenge for people to cultivate deeper consciousness of place or places where they are. So do you think the spatial turn will have a crucial significance in reimagining the future?
I think that's a wonderful question and a wonderful addition to the reflections. And I can say absolutely, living in Australia, where I'm so grateful to be influenced by perspectives from my Indigenous neighbors, the importance of place and belonging and the land that owns us certainly makes us aware of the importance of place. And that is a dimension that we are developing. And I thank you for that question. It is a great question. And thank you for making us sensitive to that dimension as well.
Well, those initial questions have been on the abstract side, perhaps structural or even metaphysical. So let's try to focus in now one or two questions that are a little bit more specific. Here is one. Emmanuel, could your framework also be applied to reform in the Catholic Church, which it might be argued has a need to unfreeze the past and use imagination for the future? So do you want to be more specific and apply any of this to that particular institution?
I think it's well known that there is a tension. Certainly, myself as a lay person, trained in theology, I'm very aware of the inequities and the systemic problems that exist. I do believe that this notion of interruption is a challenge for us as systems to be aware that we will be interrupted, and we are invited to see where new victims are being made. So I do not see any problems in bringing that critical lens to bear, even upon my own tradition. We are very far from a metanoia that is forever on the way. And we need more questions like that to goad us and to remind us of what needs to be done.
And if I might just add in there a thought from myself, I wonder if one of the frustrations, perhaps from a European context, is that the global pandemic has shown the state, the nation states of Europe, for example, able to use or exert massive levers of power in terms of financial packages and stimuli and so on and so on. But many would suppose that those levers have been pulled in order to retain a status quo, rather than to bring us to any sort of what might be called progressive vision. Is there anything you've said here that you could apply at a sort of governmental, political level over the last 2 years?
It's very clear that vaccine equity is a huge issue, and it's apparent that affluence has a way of ensuring precisely that nations will look after themselves first, and that extends itself now to boosters, etc., to other shots. And I think the advice coming out of the World Health Organization or other voices saying that only increases the inequity, but also will not help actually battle the virus, because it just gives chances for more mutations of the virus to occur. So there is a way perhaps that nature will call us to account for that. If the ethical dilemma and challenge itself is not enough to awaken us out of our, let's say, national interests.
A more specific question here, just as we are drawing to a close, this coming in from Northern Ireland. The question here asks, would you take St. John's Apocalyptic, the biblical book of Revelation, as this reboot activity that you've described in order to imagine aspects of the future and give us hope? If so, then what is the role of the revelation claimed to be from Jesus and the associated angels in that text? So perhaps this is more an exegetical question as to how that biblical text fits or otherwise with your thesis.
Right. It is one that, given the pressure on time, I would have to ponder, but it's a very good one. It is certainly a comparable text, if you will, in the apocalyptic genre, to reflect on whether we can do a comparable exercise there. I was very drawn to the Lucan narrative because of precisely its situatedness in a non-apocalyptic genre. But yes, it's worth thinking about what that would mean for the apocalypse of John. So thank you.
Well, our present is rapidly slipping into the past here, and time has really flown for me. We do have more questions, so I apologize to those to whom we haven't been able to turn in this hour. But may I say thank you to Dr. Emmanuel Nathan for that very stimulating lecture. You made humble claims at the beginning for theology and philosophy, but you've really showed us the resources that are available there for the present moment. Thank you as well to all of you for attending. Please do take a moment to look at the Laudato Si Research Institute's website. The link will be in the chat, where you'll find further resources, articles, and news about future events. You can sign up there to receive our regular newsletters or follow us indeed on Twitter or on our YouTube channel. You'll find information there as well about future events, including scholarly lectures from our next visiting fellow, Professor Norman Worsber from Duke Divinity School. So do keep your eye, please, on our website. But that just about concludes our proceedings for tonight. Thank you to all of you for joining us for this public lecture. Thank you again to Dr. Emmanuel Nathan, our Denis Edwards visiting fellow. And please enjoy the rest of your days or your evenings. And on behalf of the Laudato Si Research Institute, we look forward to seeing you again soon. So good evening to you all, and thank you.
And good morning for me.